Here's what nobody tells you about the most rejected invention in American history. A guy walks into 20 different companies with a machine that could change everything. Every single one laughs him out of the building. Today, that same machine sits in practically every office in America, and the patent behind it made billions. This is the story of Chester Carlson and patent number US 2297691A, the invention of zerography. And trust me, this isn't just another boring history lesson about some old technology. This is about a man who refused to quit even when the entire world told him his idea was worthless. Let me paint you a picture of what America looked like in the 1930s. The Great Depression had just destroyed the economy. People were desperate for work, any work, and Chester Carlson was one of those people struggling to make ends meet. But Chester had something most people didn't, a problem that bothered him so much he spent years trying to solve it. Chester worked as a patent clerk in New York City. Now, if you don't know what a patent clerk does, let me break it down for you. These people spend their entire day dealing with documents. Patents, applications, legal papers. Mountains and mountains of paper. And here's the thing that drove Chester absolutely insane. Every single time someone needed a copy of a document, they had to either retype the whole thing by hand or use carbon paper, which was messy and limited you to just a few copies, or take photographs of each page, which was expensive and time-consuming. Imagine spending 8 hours a day at work, and half of that time is just retyping documents that already exist, word for word, page after page. It was mind-numbing. It was inefficient, and Chester knew there had to be a better way. But Chester wasn't just annoyed by this problem at work. He had another reason to want to solve it. Something personal. Something that cut deep. Chester had arthritis. His hands hurt every time he had to write or type for long periods. Every document he retyped was painful. Physically painful. So for Chester, finding a solution wasn't just about making work easier. It was about survival. It was about being able to keep his job without destroying his body in the process. Now here's where most people would just complain and move on. But not Chester. Chester was different. He had studied physics at the California Institute of Technology. He understood science. He understood how things worked at a fundamental level. And he became obsessed with one question. Why couldn't there be a machine that could just copy a document instantly? Why did copying have to be so complicated? So Chester started researching. He spent every spare moment reading scientific journals and textbooks. He studied chemistry. He studied physics. He studied electricity. And slowly, piece by piece, he started to develop an idea. What if you could use light and static electricity to transfer an image from one piece of paper to another? Now, I know that sounds simple when I say it like that. But trust me, this was revolutionary thinking for the 1930s. Nobody had ever successfully done anything like this before. There were other copying methods, sure, but they were all either too expensive, too slow, or produced terrible quality copies. Chester wanted something different. Something that was fast, cheap, and produced perfect copies every single time. He called his process electrophotography. Later, it would be renamed zerography, which comes from the Greek words for dry writing. And that name is important because unlike other copying methods that used wet chemicals, Chester's process was completely dry. No messy liquids, no chemicals that could spill or stain, just light, static electricity and powder. But here's the thing about having a brilliant idea. Having the idea is the easy part. Actually making it work, that's where things get hard. Really hard. And Chester was about to learn just how hard it could be. Chester didn't have a fancy laboratory. He didn't have corporate funding. He didn't have a team of researchers helping him. He had a small apartment in Queens and whatever money he could scrape together from his day job. So he did what any obsessed inventor would do. He turned his kitchen into a laboratory. Picture this. It's 1938. Chester Carlson is standing in his kitchen with his assistant, Otto Kornai, who was an out-of-work physicist Chester had hired for a few dollars. They've got makeshift equipment scattered everywhere. Sulfur powder, metal plates, a heat source, wires running across the counter. The whole setup looks like something a mad scientist would cobble together. And Chester had a plan. A simple experiment to test whether his idea could actually work. He took a metal plate coated with sulfur. He gave it an electric charge using static electricity. Then he placed a piece of glass on top with some words written in ink. He shined a bright light on it. The light passed through the glass except where the ink blocked it. Where the light hit the sulfur, it lost its charge. Where the ink blocked the light, the charge remained. Then came the magic moment. Chester dusted the plate with lycopodium powder, which is basically plant spores. The powder stuck only to the areas that still had an electric charge, the areas where the ink had been. He pressed a piece of wax paper against the plate. Then he heated it. And when he pulled the paper away, there it was, a perfect copy of the words that had been written on the glass. The date was October 22nd, 1938. The words that appeared on that first successful copy were simple but meaningful. 10-22-38 Astoria. The date and the neighborhood where they'd made history. Chester and Otto had just created the world's first zerographic copy. The first dry copy ever made using light and static electricity. Now you'd think this would be the moment where everything changed for Chester, where his life suddenly got easier, where people started throwing money at him to develop this incredible new technology. But that's not what happened, not even close. What happened next was 7 years of rejection, 7 years of people telling Chester that his invention was useless, 7 years of doors being slammed in his face. Chester knew he couldn't develop this technology alone. He needed funding, he needed resources, he needed a company to believe in his vision. So he started approaching corporations, big companies that dealt with documents and office equipment, companies that should have been jumping at the chance to revolutionize the copying industry. He went to IBM. They said no. He went to General Electric. They said no. He went to Kodak, the biggest photography company in America. They said no. In fact, Chester approached more than 20 different companies over the next several years, and every single one of them rejected him. Every single one told him that his invention had no commercial value, that nobody would want to use it, that the existing copying methods were good enough. Can you imagine that? You've just invented something that could change the world. You know it works because you've done it with your own hands, and everyone you talk to tells you it's worthless. Most people would give up. Most people would accept that maybe they were wrong and everyone else was right. But Chester Carlson wasn't most people. Here's what those companies didn't understand. They were looking at Chester's crude prototype and judging the entire concept based on that. Yes, the early versions were slow. Yes, they were messy. Yes, they required multiple steps and produced copies that weren't perfect. But Chester wasn't asking them to buy his prototype. He was asking them to invest in the potential. He was asking them to see what this could become with proper development and resources. But corporations don't think like that. They want proven technology. They want guaranteed returns. They want something they can sell tomorrow, not something that might be amazing in 5 years. So they all passed, and Chester kept getting rejected. During this time, Chester wasn't just sitting around feeling sorry for himself. He kept improving his process. He kept experimenting. He kept filing patents to protect his ideas. And he kept believing that eventually someone would see what he saw. Someone would understand that zerography wasn't just another copying method. It was the future. Then, in 1944, something finally changed. Chester got a meeting with an organization called Battelle Memorial Institute. Now, Battelle wasn't a company trying to make money from products. They were a research and development organization. They helped inventors develop their ideas. And unlike all those corporations that had rejected Chester, Battelle actually understood what they were looking at. Battelle agreed to help develop zerography. They signed a contract with Chester that gave them the rights to develop the technology in exchange for funding the research. Finally, after years of rejection, Chester had found someone who believed in his vision, someone with the resources to help make it a reality. But even with Battelle's help, progress was slow. Zerography was incredibly complex. Getting it to work consistently was a nightmare. They had to figure out the right materials to use, the right chemicals, the right powders, the right temperatures. Every tiny variable mattered, and if any one thing was off, the whole process failed. The researchers at Battelle worked on zerography for years. They made improvements. They solved problems. They got the process to work more reliably. But they still hadn't figured out how to turn it into a commercial product. They had a laboratory technique that worked under controlled conditions. But that's not the same as having a machine that anyone could use in an office. And here's something interesting. During all this development work, Battelle started to realize just how valuable this technology could be. They'd initially thought zerography might be useful for making a few specialized types of copies. But as they worked with it, they started to see that it could do so much more. This could be the basis for an entirely new industry. So in 1947, Battelle started looking for a company that could manufacture and sell zerographic machines. They wanted a partner with experience in office equipment, someone who understood that market and could actually get these machines into businesses. And they found a small company in Rochester, New York, called the Haloid Company. Now, Haloid was not a big player. They made photographic paper. They were small. They were struggling financially. But their president, Joe Wilson, was a visionary. When he saw a demonstration of zerography, he immediately understood its potential. He saw what all those other companies had missed. This wasn't just another copying method. This was revolutionary. Haloid licensed the zerography patents from Battelle and Chester. And they went all in on developing it. I mean, completely all in. They bet their entire company on this technology. They poured money into research and development. They hired scientists and engineers. They built prototypes. They tested and refined and improved. And through it all, Joe Wilson believed. He believed in Chester's vision. He believed that zerography would change everything. But making that vision a reality was still incredibly difficult. The early machines Haloid built were massive. They were complicated. They required trained operators. They broke down constantly. And they were expensive, really expensive. The first commercial zerographic copier, called the Model A, cost almost $3,000. And it was so complex that Haloid could only sell it to companies that were willing to hire someone specifically to operate it. The Model A was not a huge success. It proved that zerography could work outside a laboratory. It proved that you could build a machine that made copies using this process. But it wasn't practical for most businesses. It wasn't the breakthrough product that would make zerography mainstream, so Haloid kept working. They kept improving the technology. They kept making the process simpler and more reliable. They kept trying to build a machine that would be easy enough for anyone to use. A machine that would make so many copies so quickly that businesses couldn't imagine working without it. And finally, in 1959, 21 years after Chester made that first copy in his kitchen, Haloid introduced the Xerox 914, and this machine changed everything. Everything. The 914 was the first automatic zerographic copier. You didn't need special training to use it. You just put your document on the glass, pressed a button, and out came a perfect copy. It was fast. It was reliable. It made copies that looked as good as the originals. And businesses went absolutely crazy for it. Within a few years, the Xerox 914 became the most successful industrial product in history up to that point. Haloid, which had renamed itself Xerox Corporation, went from a small struggling company to a massive corporation worth billions. The 914 was everywhere. Every office wanted one. Every business needed one. Xerography had finally become what Chester always knew it could be. The standard way to make copies. And remember all those companies that rejected Chester? IBM, General Electric, Kodak, and all the others. They watched as Xerox dominated the copying industry. They watched as this technology, they'd dismissed as worthless, generated billions of dollars in revenue. They'd all had the chance to own this, and they'd all said no. Now let's talk about the patent itself. US 2297691A. This patent, filed in 1939 and granted in 1942, covered the basic process of electrophotography, the method of using light and static electricity to create copies. And this patent became one of the most valuable patents in American history. But here's something most people don't realize. Chester didn't just file one patent. Over the years, he filed dozens of patents covering different aspects of xerography. He patented specific materials, specific processes, specific machine designs. He built an entire wall of intellectual property protecting his invention. And that wall of patents is what made xerography so valuable to Xerox. Nobody could copy their technology without licensing Chester's patents. Chester made a fortune from xerography. The licensing deals and royalties made him a multimillionaire. But here's what I find fascinating about Chester Carlson. He didn't let the money change who he was. He didn't become some greedy tycoon. Instead, he gave most of his money away. He donated millions to universities, charities, and research institutions. He believed in using his wealth to help others, to support education and science, to make the world better. Chester died in 1968, just 9 years after the Xerox 914 launched. He was only 62 years old, but in those final years, he got to see his invention transform the world. He got to see xerography become a word that everyone knew. He got to see Xerox machines in offices everywhere. He got to see that his 21-year struggle had been worth it. Think about what Chester's story teaches us. First, it teaches us that rejection doesn't mean you're wrong. 20 companies told Chester his invention was worthless. 20 companies were completely wrong. If Chester had listened to them, if he'd given up after the 5th rejection, or the 10th rejection, or the 15th rejection, xerography might never have been developed. Someone else might have eventually figured it out, sure, but it would have taken years longer, maybe decades longer. The world would have been worse off. Second, it teaches us that solving your own problems can lead to solving problems for millions of other people. Chester didn't set out to build a billion-dollar company. He didn't set out to revolutionize an industry. He just wanted to make his own job easier. He wanted to stop the pain in his hands from typing the same documents over and over. But in solving his own problem, he created something that made life better for everyone who worked in an office. Third, it teaches us about the importance of finding the right partners. Chester couldn't make xerography successful alone. He needed Battelle to help develop it. He needed Haloid and Joe Wilson to believe in it and manufacture it. Success rarely happens in isolation. It happens when the right people come together around a shared vision. And fourth, it teaches us that real innovation takes time. Chester made his first successful copy in 1938. The Xerox 914 didn't launch until 1959. That's 21 years. 2 decades of development, improvement, and refinement. We live in a world now where everyone wants instant success, where if something doesn't work immediately, people give up and move on to the next thing. But the most important innovations often take years or even decades to reach their full potential. Let me tell you about some of the technical challenges they had to overcome to make xerography work commercially. Because this is where the story gets really interesting from an engineering perspective. The basic principle of xerography was simple enough. Charge a surface, expose it to light, apply powder, transfer the image, heat it to make it permanent. But making each of those steps work reliably, thousands of times a day, in machines that would be used by regular office workers, that was incredibly hard. One of the biggest challenges was the photoreceptor. That's the surface that holds the electric charge. Chester's original prototype used sulfur, but sulfur was way too unstable for a commercial machine. It degraded quickly. It was sensitive to humidity. it didn't hold a charge consistently. So researchers had to find new materials. They tried selenium. They tried organic compounds. They tested hundreds of different materials before finding ones that worked reliably enough for a commercial copier. Then there was the powder, which in xerography is called toner. The toner had to stick to the charged areas on the photoreceptor. Then it had to transfer cleanly to paper. Then it had to fuse permanently when heated. But it couldn't fuse too easily or it would stick to everything. And it couldn't require too much heat or it would burn the paper. Getting the toner chemistry right took years of research, and the mechanics of the machine itself were a nightmare. You had to move paper through the machine at exactly the right speed. You had to apply the charge evenly across the entire photoreceptor. You had to shine light consistently. You had to apply toner without getting it everywhere. You had to transfer the image without smudging. You had to fuse it without jamming. Every single step had to work perfectly in sequence, over and over again. And if any one step failed, the whole process failed. The Xerox 914 was called the 914 because it could copy pages up to 9 by 14 inches. And it was huge. It weighed 650 pounds. It was the size of a large desk. But despite its size, it could make 7 copies per minute, which was incredibly fast for that time. And the copies were perfect. They looked exactly like the originals. Businesses had never seen anything like it. Xerox didn't just sell the 914, they leased it. They charged companies a monthly fee plus a per-copy charge. This was a brilliant business model because it meant businesses didn't have to pay the full cost up front. They could start using the machine immediately and pay as they went. And once businesses started using the 914, they couldn't imagine going back to the old ways of making copies. The monthly fees added up to massive recurring revenue for Xerox. The success of the 914 created an entire industry. Xerox became one of the most valuable companies in America. The word Xerox became synonymous with copying. People would say they were going to Xerox something even if they were using a different brand of copier. The brand name became a verb. That's how dominant Xerox was. But success brought new challenges. Other companies saw how much money Xerox was making and wanted a piece of it. They tried to develop their own copying technologies that didn't infringe on Chester's patents. Some succeeded. Companies like Canon and Ricoh eventually developed their own zerographic copiers. The copying industry became competitive. Xerox's monopoly didn't last forever, but they'd had enough of a head start that they remained a dominant player for decades. And xerography kept evolving. Engineers found ways to make copiers smaller, faster, and cheaper. They found ways to make them more reliable. They added features like automatic document feeders and collating and stapling. They figured out how to make color copies. Xerography went from being a revolutionary new technology to being a mature, refined technology that just worked. Today, xerography is still the basis for most photocopiers and laser printers. Yes, laser printers. The same basic process that Chester invented in his kitchen is what makes your printer work. A laser beam charges the photoreceptor instead of a light shining through a document, but the rest of the process is essentially the same. Light, static electricity, toner, heat. The fundamentals haven't changed. Think about how many copies have been made using xerography since 1938. Billions. Trillions, probably. Every office document. Every school handout. Every flyer and poster and manual. Most of them were made using the process that Chester Carlson invented. That's his legacy. Not just the money he made or the patents he filed, but the fundamental change he made to how the world shares information. Before xerography, making copies was expensive and time-consuming. Information was harder to spread. If you wanted to share a document with 10 people, you had to either retype it 10 times or make 10 carbon copies, which was messy and limited. Xerography made copying so easy and cheap that information could flow freely. That had huge implications for business, for education, for government, for everything. Some historians argue that xerography was one of the key technologies that enabled the information age. It came along at just the right time. After World War II, The American economy was booming. Businesses were growing. They needed to share more information more quickly. Zerography gave them the tool to do that. It accelerated the pace of business. It made organizations more efficient. It changed how people worked, and Chester Carlson made all of that possible. A guy with arthritis who was tired of retyping documents. A guy who got rejected by 20 companies. A guy who spent 7 years being told his idea was worthless. He changed the world because he refused to give up. Because he believed in his vision even when nobody else did. Because he kept working and kept improving and kept pushing forward no matter what. There's one more part of Chester's story that I think is really important. After he became wealthy, Chester could have just retired and enjoyed his money. He could have bought mansions and yachts and lived a life of luxury. But that's not what he did. He gave away over $150 million to various causes. That's worth way more in today's money. He was deeply interested in philosophy and social justice. He supported civil rights organizations. He funded scientific research. He believed that his success carried a responsibility to help others. In a letter Chester wrote late in his life, he said that his satisfaction didn't come from the money or the recognition. It came from knowing that his invention had made a meaningful contribution to society, that it had made people's lives easier, that it had helped spread knowledge and information. That's what mattered to him. Not the billions of dollars his invention generated, but the positive impact it had on the world. And that's the kind of perspective that's pretty rare, especially among people who become extremely wealthy. Chester could have been bitter about all those years of rejection. He could have been angry at the companies that turned him down. But he wasn't. He was grateful that he'd eventually found the right partners. He was happy that his invention had succeeded. He was focused on using his wealth to do good. So what can we learn from Chester Carlson and the story of zerography? What lessons can we apply to our own lives and our own challenges? I think there are several important ones. First, don't let rejection define you. 20 companies told Chester no, but those 20 no's don't matter because eventually he found the people who said yes. If you believe in something, if you know in your gut that it has value, keep pushing forward even when people tell you you're wrong. Not every idea succeeds, but the ones that do succeed are usually the ones that people initially dismissed. Second, solve real problems. Chester didn't invent zerography because he thought it would make him rich. He invented it because he had a real problem that needed solving. The best innovations come from people who are trying to fix something that's actually broken. If you're looking for ideas to pursue, start with your own frustrations. What makes your life harder than it needs to be? What takes too much time or causes too much pain? Those frustrations are opportunities. Third, be willing to iterate and improve. Chester's first xerographic copy in 1938 was crude. It barely worked. It took 21 more years to turn it into the Xerox 914. That's 2 decades of improvement and refinement. Whatever you're working on, don't expect it to be perfect on the first try. Expect it to be rough and flawed and problematic. Then, make it better. Then, make it better again. Keep iterating until it becomes what it needs to be. Fourth, find the right partners. Chester couldn't make xerography successful alone. He needed Battelle. He needed Haloid. He needed Joe Wilson. Success is rarely a solo achievement. Find people who share your vision. Find people who have skills and resources you don't have. Build a team. Collaborate. The right partners can make the impossible possible. And fifth, if you're fortunate enough to succeed, think about what you'll do with that success. Will you hoard it? Or will you use it to help others? Chester chose to give most of his money away. He chose to support causes he believed in. He chose to make the world better. Not everyone has to give away $150 million. But everyone can think about how their success can benefit more than just themselves. The story of zerography is a reminder that the future isn't created by committees or corporations or people playing it safe. The future is created by individuals with vision, by people who see a problem and refuse to accept that it can't be solved, by people who are willing to endure years of rejection and failure because they believe in something bigger than themselves. Chester Carlson was that kind of person. He saw a world where copying documents was painful and expensive and time-consuming, and he imagined a different world, a world where copying was instant and easy and cheap. Then he spent 21 years making that imagined world real, and now we all live in the world he created. Every time you make a copy or print a document, you're using technology that exists because Chester refused to quit. Patent US 2297691A might just be a number in a database, but it represents something much more important than that. It represents human persistence, human creativity, human refusal to accept limitations. It represents one man's vision becoming reality against all odds. And it represents the power of believing in yourself even when the entire world tells you you're wrong. So the next time you walk past a copy machine in an office, take a second to think about Chester Carlson. Think about the guy who got laughed out of 20 companies. The guy who spent years working in his kitchen trying to solve a problem nobody else thought was worth solving. The guy who changed the world because he was stubborn enough to keep going when everyone else would have quit. That's the real story behind the machine, and it's a story worth remembering. Subscribe for more stories like this.